It wasn't on the wedding day, or at the bridal shower, or the times I was welcomed with warm cake and cold hugs. It was on a gray morning, between hospital sheets, and the acidic smell of disinfectant, that my mother-in-law looked at me for the first time, as if I weren't just her son's wife, but a whole woman, a woman with choices, guilt, and crosses to bear. She had been hospitalized for days. The doctors said it was only a matter of time. Not much. And still, the room stayed with curtains open and the TV off, as if death didn't deserve darkness or distraction. I stayed with her during the shifts no one wanted, the quiet ones, from 4 to 8 in the morning, when your eyes burn more than your feet and memories blend with fear. She no longer ate, barely spoke. But that dawn, she called me by my name. Not girl, not daughter-in-law, not my son's wife. She used my given name. And when she said it, it felt heavy, as if the sound carried something she'd been rehearsing for years. "Cheat on my son," she whispered, "for his own good." I stood there, my hand still resting on the glass of water I hadn't handed her. I thought she was delirious, but her gaze was clear, steady, no fever, no confusion, just the lucidity of someone who knows she won't be going home. She didn't repeat it, didn't explain, just turned her face and closed her eyes as if signing a sentence. And I, who until then had borne everything in silence, my husband's absences, the poorly memorized excuses, the empty stares at dinner, felt something inside me shift, as if someone had opened the door to a room I'd been hiding in for years. It wasn't in that moment that I understood what she meant, but that sentence stayed with me, chewing at me, like a secret shared without context, like a map handed over without a route. And even so, for the first time, I felt seen. The mother-in-law who had always studied me with eyes full of suspicion was now throwing me an impossible dilemma. Cheat, not out of desire, not for revenge, but for a greater good. What could that even mean? When I got home that morning, the sun was already weakly hitting the roof tiles. My husband was sleeping as if the world weren't falling apart just a hallway away. The coffee had gone cold on the table I'd set the night before. No note, no message, just silence between us. And it was there, looking at that man who no longer looked at me, that I began to remember everything. The early signs, the interrupted phone calls, the forgotten birthdays, the excuses that smelled like rehearsed lies, but also the moments when I pretended not to see, because I loved him, because it was easier to keep the house standing than to dismantle the rubble of my own life. In the days that followed, her phrase returned like a prayer. Cheat on my son for his own good. I wanted to understand. I needed to understand. But time doesn't always give answers. It gives choices, and she gave me one. The following week, she died, without repeating the phrase, without giving clues. She simply left me with the heaviest inheritance anyone could carry, the permission to hurt, in the name of good. And it was only after the funeral, when I found the notebook hidden in the back of the kitchen drawer, the notebook where she wrote recipes and stray thoughts, that I began to piece the puzzle together. Between the corn cake recipe and a scribbled prayer, I read a sentence heavily underlined. Sometimes, saving someone requires that we become the villain in their story. That night, I didn't sleep. There are details in a marriage that don't fit in photographs or wedding speeches. They're tiny but sharp fragments, things we hide even from ourselves, like the sound of a key turning in the door too late, the smell of new perfume on an old shirt, the way a "how are you" becomes a silent wave with no answer. At first I thought it was just time. That love changes color over the years, like sheets faded by the sun. But over time I realized that some absences aren't temporary, they're intentional, calculated. And he, my husband, no longer came home like someone in a hurry. He came back like someone fulfilling an obligation. There were never any fights. No slamming doors. Quite the opposite. Too much silence. Silence at dinner. Silence in the questions. Silence in the touch that stopped happening. And deep down, I knew. But I chose to sweep it under the faith I inherited from my mother. The same faith that taught me not to expose wounds in public, to keep dirty laundry inside my chest, and to pray for the home even when the home was just walls. But my mother-in-law's phrase stayed there, echoing, like a candle lit deep in my soul. Cheat on my son for his own good. It ate at me from the inside out, and at the same time, strangely, it gave me strength, as if she had given me permission to see what I had been avoiding. I started to observe the schedules, the messages, the unexplained absences, but it wasn't to confront, it wasn't to fight, it was to understand what she wanted to show me. Because if that woman, who had always measured me with cold eyes, decided to give me advice on her deathbed, it was because she knew what was coming. I figured it out little by little. Nothing explicit, no compromising photo, no daring message. But there was a woman, another woman, and she wasn't younger, nor prettier. She was the opposite of me, unburdened, no kids, no prayers, none of the pains life stacks on the backs of those who try to be everything. She was his rest, and I, his mirror. He didn't hide it well, but he didn't care to hide it either, because he already saw me as part of the furniture in the house. useful, stable, silent, and that was the greater betrayal, not of the flesh, but of the soul, making me invisible. I spent days thinking about what to do. Scream, confront, expose him, but none of those ideas matched my mother-in-law's words. It was something deeper. She didn't tell me to strike back. She told me to betray, and not out of pain, but for good. That's when I understood. It wasn't about giving back in the same coin. It was about breaking the cycle, being unfaithful to the role they gave me, the role of the woman who puts up with everything, who accepts crumbs, who dies in silence, to betray the destiny imposed on me, to betray the idea that a good wife is the one who stays, to betray the script handed to me at the altar, and little by little I began. I changed my schedule, started going out alone, saving my own money, reconnecting with old contacts, looking at myself in the mirror without rushing. It wasn't rebellion, it was rescue. I was betraying the version of myself that had learned to survive without living. He noticed, and he didn't like it. He started to get uncomfortable, to try to come back, to probe me. But it was too late. I was crossing the bridge, and this time, I wasn't coming back. In the town where I grew up, the word separation was whispered like it tasted of rust. It was one of those things everyone knew about, but no one said out loud, like a bad illness or an unwanted guest. To separate was, for many, a synonym for failure, and for a woman, failure was almost a blood crime. That's why it took me so long to admit that what I was living was no longer a marriage. It was a poorly divided chore chart, a daily play where only one still knew the lines. And even so, I stayed. For the boy, our son. He didn't know a thing, and I made sure of that. Children, even when young, sense what we try to hide. But he was still little, enough to believe that the silence between his parents was just tiredness, and that hurt me more than any affair. It was for him that I hesitated, that I kept quiet so many times, that I stopped going, stopped being, stopped asking. It was for him that I accepted being that woman, half shadow, half resistance, and still, my mother-in-law's words haunted me. Betray my son. It wasn't just advice. It was a request with an expiration date, and with each day I stayed, it felt more and more like I was hurting my own son, not by leaving, but by staying. One afternoon, while organizing the closet at the back of the house, I found the box where I had kept letters from my youth, letters exchanged with friends, cousins, even with myself. There was one, in particular, in my mother's handwriting. A short letter, written on one of the worst days of her life, when she had to leave my father because of something no one dared to name at the time, violence of silence. She wrote, "Daughter, we shouldn't die inside just to keep the house standing, because a child who truly loves would rather see their mother alive and far away than dead and nearby." I closed my eyes, cried without a sound, just like my mother used to cry. And in that moment, I fully understood. The betrayal my mother-in-law had asked of me wasn't against the marriage. It was against the model of blind sacrifice she had lived through herself. Maybe she had seen in me the chance to save her son from repeating the same cycle, and more importantly, to save her grandson, my boy. That week, I started looking for a place for us, a small corner, but ours, with a window that caught the morning sun and the sound of birds at dusk. Something simple, safe, where he could grow up without the weight of the silences I carried. My husband noticed the distance, but still thought it was just a phase. Only when I left the house key on the table, along with a short note, "Take good care of your freedom, because now I'm going to take care of mine," did he understand. There was no scandal. No begging, just a look that mixed anger and shock. He knew I wasn't one to make threats, and that was my betrayal, the deepest I could offer, leaving for myself, not for someone else. When my son asked why we were going to live somewhere else, I didn't lie. I just said, because Mom needs peace too, and ours was getting lost in here. He didn't cry, didn't complain. He held my hand like someone who understands, even without fully knowing, and in that gesture, I knew I had made the right choice. On the first night in the new house, barely any furniture, no curtains, nothing. We made popcorn on the old stove. He fell asleep on the mattress still on the floor, and I, for the first time in years, slept without fear of tomorrow. Waking up in a place where no one expects you to pretend was the first peace I had known in many years. It wasn't comfort. It was a cold floor, unpainted walls, the sound of neighbors early in the morning, but it was mine, and my son's, and that was enough. We started our life there with no big plans, just the basics. A borrowed mattress, one pot, an old thermos my friend gave me when she heard I was starting over. They used that word, starting over, but it wasn't that. It was a beginning, because what came before was just survival. The following days were quiet. There weren't many people to explain anything to, and frankly, it wasn't anyone's business. The neighbor women looked at me with that mix of curiosity and respect. Deep down, they knew that for a woman to walk out of her house with a child in her arms and her soul in pieces, something serious must have happened. My ex-husband called now and then, at first, demanding explanations, later asking about our son, and with time came only silence, as if he too had understood that the story ended there, not with shouting, but with the door slowly closing. My mother-in-law didn't live to see it happen. She passed before, but somehow, I felt she knew that her advice wasn't given by accident. Maybe it was a twisted way of making amends for all the times she treated me like part of the furniture. Maybe in the end, she wanted to protect me, to protect her grandson, and maybe even her own son. The afternoons were slow, and in them, I learned to breathe without guilt, to cook just for two, to listen to music again. Little things, like hanging laundry and seeing the sun hit the fabric. Like watching my boy play on the living room floor, and knowing that there, on that simple floor, there was more dignity than in many of the perfectly set dinners we used to have. I started working at a local school, half days, cleaning. Then I was asked to help in the kitchen. The principal liked my cooking. She said it tasted like home. That moved me more than any compliment I've ever received. Cooking for others reminded me that I still knew how to care, that I hadn't lost that in the middle of all the pain. And seeing my son eat with joy, laughing with the other kids, I realized that even without all we used to have, he now had something he never had before: lightness. Little by little, I built a new routine, and with it came what I feared most: time to think. Because when life is busy, we just act. But when it slows down, the weight of the questions comes. Did I do the right thing? Did I destroy more than I saved? Will he blame me someday? But every time those questions came, I remembered what I read in my mother-in-law's notebook. Saving someone sometimes means being the villain in their story. And what if that was it? What if in my son's eyes my leaving was a betrayal, a wound? Maybe. But with time, maybe he'd see what it really was. An act of love with the scent of courage. Because it's not every day that a woman betrays the silence where they buried her will to live. At the bottom of the last drawer in the school's supply closet, between old papers and cracked plastic cups, I found a hand towel embroidered with a woman's name. The stitching almost faded, but still readable. Irene, my mother-in-law's name. Someone must have left it there, maybe without knowing that in a way, it belonged to me too. I took it home without saying a word, washed it carefully, let it dry on the clothesline, and I watched it flutter in the wind as if it were a forgotten message. It was just a towel, but to me it became a sign that she still walked with me, because ever since I left that house, I hadn't dreamed of her again. And for someone raised hearing that those who love appear in dreams, that bothered me. I wanted a word from her, a gesture, anything. The towel was that, a presence without speech, a reminder that some women only learn to communicate after they die. And maybe that's what she was trying to do in that final sentence, to save me from the same path of silences that devoured her whole life. I started writing in a small notebook I bought at the market. It wasn't a diary, more like a record of thoughts, memories, conversations I never had. I wrote to her, and I wrote to myself too, words I had never said out loud. Today the boy asked me if his dad will come to his birthday. I said yes, but I don't know. He hardly ever calls. Today I looked in the mirror and saw a woman, not a victim. A woman who decided. That's already a lot. Today I understood that freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's no longer needing to lie to keep going. Writing became my way of stitching together the parts that still hurt. And there were many, because separation, even when fair, leaves holes, and we learn to walk with them. Before I go on, if stories like this stay with you, if you believe that some pains need to be spoken so they don't become inheritance, subscribe to the channel. It's just a button, but for those of us carrying so much, it can feel like shelter. And if you feel like it, leave a comment after. I read everything with an open heart. One afternoon, as school was letting out, I saw my son standing by the gate with a piece of paper in his hand. It was a drawing, him and me, holding hands. No trace of the father, no sign of sadness, just a blue sky and sun. It broke me, because I understood, in a quiet and clear way, that he was okay too. That maybe, deep down, he already knew that everything had been done out of love, even if he didn't yet understand the word. That same week the news came. My ex-husband was moving, another state, new job, new life. He asked to see his son before leaving. We arranged for Sunday. He arrived in a rush, tried to mask the discomfort, brought an expensive gift, tried to play, but the boy was shy, distant, like someone who no longer recognizes the voice he used to call Dad. The visit didn't last long. At the door, he looked at me with tired eyes, the kind of look from someone who understands too late. "He's doing well," was all he said. I nodded. There was nothing left to explain, because sometimes absence is the answer. After he left, my son came up to me and asked, "Mom, why did Dad go away?" I hugged him tight and answered, "Because sometimes people who don't take care lose." He went quiet and accepted it. Children can tell when the truth comes with love. That night, I dreamed of my mother-in-law. We were sitting at a table. She didn't speak, just looked at me with an expression I had never seen in life. Gratitude. There was no judgment, no pain, just a calm that ran deep through my chest. I woke up with a light heart, for the first time in a long time. When we choose the right path, There's no applause, no stage, no victory song, just a floor to sweep, bills to pay, and silence. The kind of silence that comes after the storm. But it's not peace. It's a kind of inner reconstruction, like hearing your own broken pieces fall, slowly, and finally knowing that they'll land somewhere safe. The months passed with the urgency of someone trying to erase marks. Time seemed to conspire to show me that living really is a constant restart. But there was something new in me, a firmness, a more direct gaze, and it wasn't pride nor rebellion. It was a kind of dignity that only comes after the fall. My son was growing up well, strong, with a carefree laugh and questions that made me think more than answer. He gave me news of my own transformation without realizing it, when he drew me taller, when he called me my brave mom, even though no one had taught him that. It was like he was my clear mirror. At school, I began to grow. First in the kitchen, then into the administrative side. One day, the principal called me in for a chat. "Have you ever thought about going back to school?" I laughed inside. "Study? After everything?" But she insisted. "You're great with people, and sharp. Sometimes all it takes is someone telling you that you can." Those words echoed in me for days, until I gathered the courage. I enrolled in a night course for social work. I started scared, afraid I wouldn't keep up, that I was too old, that I'd mess up. But I went, because now I had a name, I had a story, and it wasn't just made of pain. In one class, the professor talked about family repetition cycles, how pain gets inherited if we don't break it. That hit me like a knife, because right there, I understood clearly. My mother-in-law didn't give me advice. She gave me a chance she never had. And maybe she saw that in me. It was her way of breaking the chain. She didn't save the marriage, but she saved what came after. Around that same time, I ran into an old friend from my youth. We had lost touch for years. She recognized me at the market, hugged me like she was holding on to time. I heard what happened. They said you were brave. Not many are. Brave. Another word that for so long felt far from me. But now, hearing it like that, it seemed to fit. And more than that, it gave me responsibility. I started writing more. Not just for myself, but for other women. Short texts that I pinned to the school's bulletin board. Phrases about self-love, boundaries, the everyday kind of simple faith. Some of the mothers came to talk to me afterward, said those words made them think. That's when I realized my pain, once turned into words, became a seed. And without meaning to, I began to be an example. Not the kind that waves flags or shouts, but the kind that lives quietly, steadily, with small steps. The kind that teaches just by being there, whole. I, who had been betrayed, who betrayed the idea of the submissive woman, was now seen as a woman who saved herself. And that, more than any victory, was a legacy, because being fair often means doing what looks wrong in the eyes of others, and doing it anyway. It had been over a year since I left that house. Time had done the work that no advice could fully do. It repositioned me in the world, not just as a woman, but as someone who had learned to stand on her own, without emotional crutches, without inherited guilt. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that shows up unannounced. I was making breakfast in a rush because my boy had a test. He was older now, already tied his own shoes, already had opinions about things, and in the middle of that routine, between the blender noise and the smell of toast, the phone rang. It was my ex-husband. I answered with the calm of someone who no longer expects anything. His voice was low, different. He asked about our son, said he missed him. We didn't talk much. He told me things weren't easy, that the new life wasn't what he thought it would be. And then, in the silence, he said, "Thank you for doing what you did. I didn't understand back then. I do now." I said nothing, because I didn't expect it. Not because I didn't deserve it, but because you get used to the lack of recognition, like you get used to an old toothache. You just go on living anyway. He didn't say sorry. He didn't need to. That phrase said it all. It was the unspoken confession of a man who only understood once he had lost. And not just me, but the peace that once existed before he drained it. After the call, I sat at the table with my son. He was eating slowly, focused. And I watched him like someone seeing a story being rewritten, because there he was, a boy growing up without fear, without unnecessary weight, without repeating the life his parents once lived. "Will you pick me up today?" he asked. I nodded, smiled. "I will, my son, always will." And in that moment, I understood what my mother-in-law meant by betray out of love. She knew her son wouldn't change. She knew I was walking the same path she had walked in silence. And at the end of her life, she did what she could, warned me, in her own way, with the words she had left in the time that remained. It was never about him, never. It was about me, about the boy, about what we carry forward. The following week, I took my notebook to the women's group at church. I read a piece at a time, not like a speech, but as a sharing. Some cried, others just listened, eyes glassy with emotion. At the end, an older woman came up to me. She held my hand and said, "You wrote what so many of us here feel, but don't know how to say." And that's when I knew the story had become more than pain. It had become echo. On the school wall, there was a new board, a space where the kids could draw freely what they wanted to be when they grew up. There were firefighters, singers, teachers, astronauts, and there, among colored pencil scribbles, I saw my son's drawing, a woman with her hair tied up and a notebook in her hand. Below it, written in crooked letters, "My mom writes things that help people." I stood still, heart tight in a sweet way. I didn't cry. I felt it, and that was enough. Because the woman who began this story, with lowered eyes, hands always busy caring for others, her body living in a house that no longer wanted her, was now someone else, with the same face, the same features, but a different name in the mirror. I was no longer the wife, not just the mother, not the one who was left, not the one who left. I was a woman who walked through her own ruin without asking for applause, without asking for forgiveness. The pain still showed up from time to time, in memories, in old scents, in dreams that came without warning. But it didn't hurt the same anymore. It hurt like a scar, present, but already closed. I began walking alongside other women, listening to similar stories, some harsher, others quieter, and I noticed a pattern. Most of them believed they were wrong for choosing their own peace. I slowly came to understand that my story wasn't an exception. It was a portrait, and speaking about it wasn't just an act of courage. It was reparation, not for me, but for all those who came before and couldn't say anything, and for those who would still come. My son grew up seeing that, seeing what it means to be strong without growing hard, what it means to care without disappearing, what it means to have faith without clinging to someone who doesn't show respect. And the most beautiful part was seeing that, over time, he began to understand, not through words, but through actions, in the way he hugged me, in the respect he showed to the women around him, in the silent pride he carried when he said my name to others. Because in the end, what my mother-in-law gave me in that whispered phrase was more than advice. It was a legacy, a final act of love disguised as madness. And today, when I think of her, I don't remember the difficult mother-in-law. I remember the tired woman who, at the edge of death, handed me the key to an entire life. No one writes stories like this in moral textbooks. They don't fit in guidebooks. They don't belong in sermons, because they challenge everything women have been taught for generations, that to love is to endure, that to marry is to remain silent, that to be a mother is to disappear a little inside. But this story, my story, exists to show something else. Yes, I betrayed. I betrayed the world's expectations. I betrayed my mother's silence. I betrayed the shadow of my grandmothers, who died loyal to men who never really knew who they were. I betrayed the role of obedient woman, of patient wife, of invisible martyr. And in that betrayal, I was more faithful than ever. Faithful to what is right, faithful to my son, faithful to my dignity, faithful to the truth that lives deep in the chest, and that, when ignored, rots the soul. For a long time, I was taught to stay, to swallow, to pray in the dark, hoping for a miracle to change someone else. But I learned through pain and exhaustion that the real miracle is when we are the ones who change first. When we rise from the chair, life sat us in and say, "I won't accept less than I deserve." The world will call it rebellion, coldness, abandonment, but it's not. It's care. It's love that begins in oneself and overflows into our children, our neighbors, the other women watching in silence, waiting for courage to be born in them too. My mother-in-law gave me a gift without wrapping, a warning in the form of a sentence. She didn't have time to explain. She just planted the phrase and left. But what she did was an act of redemption, of ancestral feminine wisdom. She gave me the chance to break a cycle. She entrusted me with the future she herself never had. Today, my son grows up in a home with truth, where no one yells, but also no one lies, where he learns that love is not pain in disguise. And if one day he loves a woman, may he treat her wholly. And if one day she leaves, may he understand that maybe, just maybe, she's saving them both. I still keep Irene's embroidered towel in my house. It's not a memento of a mother-in-law. It's a symbol of a woman who lived suffocated and in her last breath used her voice to free another. And me? I keep going. With scars that tell, without shame, the price I paid to stay alive inside. With a name that no longer depends on anyone else's surname to matter. With a heart that's clean, not for lack of pain, but because I chose not to carry what wasn't mine. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to so many who, in silence, hear the call to betray and still remain faithful to what is most sacred, their own life. If this story touched something in you, if it reminds you of something you've lived, or someone you know lives like this, share it, not for the numbers, but for the power a single story can have in another woman's life. Leave in the comments what this story made you remember or feel. And if you want to hear more stories like this, of pain, courage, and truth, subscribe to the channel. Here, every week, we light a candle against silence.